then the British, then and the Poles, then the British. He's been arrested, and they don't know what's happened to him. All they know, he's been arrested by the Gestapo. Number one. Number two, Garbo's wife is a security risk. They're afraid that she's threatened to go to the Spanish embassy and blab to what's going on because she hates England. Bertrand, Bertrand, who was Thilo Schmidt's French contact, he's been arrested by the Gestapo. He might be a double agent. Lily Sergeyev, otherwise known as Treasure, she threatens to tell the Germans as revenge over the death of her beloved dog. And Johnny Jepson's being tortured by the Gestapo in Gestapo torture chamber in the basement on Wilhelmstrasse in Berlin. So there are 5 sources. Let me get my cursor back over here. There are 5 sources who know of either the Enigma decrypts and or the Allied deception plans. 5 sources are huge risks now, and it only takes one of them to talk. Let me explain the background I have on today. This is a room. This is Southwick House. Southwick House is near Southampton. It was Eisenhower's D-Day headquarters. He moved his headquarters as D-Day got close. He moved his headquarters from London down to the coast. And this is a picture. Here I am in 2014. This is Eisenhower's map room in Southwick House. The map was made by a British toy maker called Chad Valley, and Chad Valley still exists. It's still a toy company owned by Sainsbury's, one of the big English department stores, and they manufactured this map in the British Midlands near Birmingham. But as you can tell, it shows where D-Day is going to be. So they can't just tell Chad Valley, make me a map of this one you see on the picture. What they did, the Brits had them make a map for security reasons, had them make a map of this same scale that rather than covering this area, went from the top of Norway to the French-Spanish border. It was some 3,000, close to 3,500 miles of coastline. This map covers about 350 miles. Essentially goes from, on the English side, from Dover upper right to Land's End and lower left, or Calais on the French side, Calais down to probably close to Brest. So the map they bought and the map that was delivered to Southwick House was 10 times this size. So they had a carpenter crew to install it, and obviously the British told them which panels they wanted installed. So now the carpenters were a party to the secret. They knew where it was going to be, and these carpenters, after this map was installed, they were put under house arrest in Southwick House and watched 24/7 until September. So that's one of the hazards of knowing. It shows in some bit of detail the maps, the beaches. There's Utah Beach here, one of the American beaches. There were 2 beaches at Omaha. The British named their beaches after fish, and they named them goldfish, jellyfish, and swordfish. And you may be thinking, oh, wait a minute, I don't remember a jellyfish beach. And of course, for shortness, goldfish got shortened to gold. Swordfish got shortened to sword, which we know of today. And jelly would have been shortened, or jellyfish would have been shortened to jelly. Churchill saw this, and he knew that the 2 beaches to the left of this map were American. gold and sword were British beaches. The beach in the center between the British beaches was Canadian. And he said, I am not going to write a letter to a Canadian mother and tell her that her son died on Jelly Beach. Change the damn name. So they changed the name to Juneau, which is the beach name we know today. So that's the story behind the map in the background. Really big payoff. Churchill told Stalin at Tehran that in wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies. And the overall Allied deception plan around the world was called Operation Bodyguard. The deception plan just for D-Day, a subset of it was Operation Fortitude. And its objectives were pretty simple. It was the overall deception plan. They wanted to confuse the Germans as to the time and particularly the place. Could it be Norway? Could it be the Pas-de-Calais? Make them think it's any place but Normandy. And I've got a little film clip from The World at War. Sir Laurence Olivier will be the narrator and give some background on the deception plan, not just with information, but actually things that they did, like bombing, for example. This will tell you, here you see in the bottom center of the map, you see a little yellow line. That pretty much outlines the invasion beaches sector in Normandy. And obviously we'll try to convince the Germans that it's going to happen in Norway or Calais. They'll undertake some bombing, you'll see in this clip. And for every one bomb that falls in the Normandy area, 2 bombs will fall in Calais.
It's also occupied Supreme Command. Among the most elaborate were fake preparations for an attack on Norway, to be launched from Scotland, and, more credibly, for a main assault on the Pas-de-Calais from the southeast ports. Also crucial was the bombing plan to cut German communications to the invasion area's interdiction.
What one had to do was to interfere with the communication. And again, I think this is a lesson learned from Dieppe, that we hadn't realized at Dieppe how absolutely essential it was to have an absolutely overwhelming weight of firepower, both from the air and from the land. The result of this was, and I think this caused a good deal of difficulties at high level, was that Air Marshal Harris, who still thought that he could win the war on his own, had to be persuaded to use his heavy bombers to attack the German road and rail communications. And I think he resisted very strongly, because he thought it was really a diversion from the whole point of the war. But he was made to do it, and it was done enormously effectively.
Spring 1944 saw widespread air attacks on road and rail targets and on airfields.
So they undertake the bombing of the German, the rail lines, the highway network, but more bombs, twice as many bombs fell in Calais as did Normandy. And this is a time for strange ways, particularly this fellow. This is British Colonel David Strangeways. He was Montgomery's chief deception officer. And like his boss, he was insufferable. He was a real pain in the neck. Efforts had been made to convince the Germans that Calais would be the target, Normandy a diversion, not just the information that was passed across, but information that the double-cross agents would pass across, that conspicuously very large orders of Michelin Map 51, which is the Palais de Calais area, had been made. But Strangeways thought that this whole deception plan was still not right, and he rewrites the whole thing. And he comes up with an idea of a fake army, a completely fake army. And by the way, Strangeways, our connection back to Ian Fleming, how so much of this stuff that went on fed Fleming. If you remember the movie Dr. No, the first James Bond movie, the fellow who dies early in the movie is the British MI6 station chief in Jamaica, and his name was Strangeways. So Fleming just lifted all kinds of stuff from names, places, things, and so forth. But anyway, he comes up with an idea of a completely fake army and was called the first U.S. Army Group, or commonly called FUSAG. It was a total fake army group led by General George S. Patton. Patton had more respect than any other Allied commander from the Germans, but they had rubber tanks and airplanes, tons of bogus radio traffic. Patton would be touring Southeast England, making public addresses, and the German respect for Patton made it credible. They believed that if any commander was going to command this cross-channel invasion, it would be Patton. They didn't know that Patton had been disgraced for slapping a soldier in Sicily. Probably would have been, it could, in today's time, it would have been a career ender. But Eisenhower knew he needed somebody with Patton's skills at the right time. Anyhow, this FUSAG was to be located in Southeast England, near the Dover, Canterbury, Kent area, right across from Calais. I'm going to show you a clip from a movie, one of the public appearances that Patton made in a small town in Southeast England, and I'll show you that this actually happened. And let's take a look at it.
Nasty-faced son of a bitch, Captain. Brad for combat. I'm going to call him William the Cop.
General, maybe you ought to leave him in the car.
No, it's all right. Good afternoon, lady.
Good afternoon.
What's this cut?
General, he'll kill that dog.
Now, hold it.
I'm terribly sorry, General. Did Abigail frighten your dog?
That's quite all right.
This way, sir.
Your name isn't William. It's Willie.
My dear friend, General George S. Patton, Jr. has accepted our invitation to say a few words to you on the occasion of this inaugural ceremony. General Patton is not here in an official capacity, and I have assured him most earnestly that nothing he says will be quoted. May I present General Patton?
Remember, sir, watch your language.
Yeah.
My dear ladies, until today, my only experience at welcoming has been to welcome Germans and Italians to the infernal region. At this I have been quite successful, since the troops which I've had the honor to command have to date killed or captured some 170,000 of our enemies. that such clubs as these are of very real value, because I believe with Mr. Bernard Shaw that the British and the Americans are two peoples separated by a common language. And since it is the evident destiny of the British and Americans to rule the world, the better we know each other, the better we will do it.
The Russians, don't forget the Russians.
I think that a club like this is an ideal place for promoting mutual understanding. Because as soon as our soldiers meet and get to know the English ladies and write home and tell our women just how lovely you truly are, then the sooner the American ladies will get jealous and force this war to a quick termination. Then I will get a chance to go to the Pacific and kill Japanese.
In cities all over the nation, mass meetings are held to protest General George Patton's statement that Britain and America will rule the post-war world, that Russia will have nothing to say. Congressional leaders like Senator Claiborne Foss are quick to react.
This man has insulted our Russian allies, implying Anglo-American world rule. In my opinion, he should be severely...
So, now, multiple sources say that Patton did indeed credit the Russians, but the Doublecross committee leaked to the press that he did not, simply to create this controversy. And Anthony K. Brown, who wrote a book called Bodyguard of Lies, said it was clearly a British government representative, and actually named him, that almost certainly released Patton's remarks to the media, part of this Fusag deception. And that club actually existed. Here's a English history marker that's there today. There were rubber tanks all over Kent. There were rubber airplanes. Here's a P-51 that's not inflated yet. And the irony is, it's not clear that the Germans ever saw any of these fake weapons. They had pretty much stopped any cross-channel aerial reconnaissance by that time because they had no air strength whatsoever. But nonetheless, had they seen them, they would have seen a huge army. But what they did here is a radio traffic and so forth. There was Fortitude North, two aspects of this deception: to make the Germans believe that an attack in Norway was likely. There were some 300,000 German soldiers there. Keep them in Norway. And Fortitude South was to make the Germans believe that the Pas de Calais was the main target, and that Normandy or Brittany or Bordeaux or anything like was simply a diversion. And that's objective was to keep the 15th Army, some 175, 200,000 troops, I believe, in the Pas de Calais area. And Eisenhower himself told the Doublecross committee that I want you to, the quote was, keep the 15th Army at Calais, keep the 15th Army out of my hair for 3 days. That's what I need. 3 days. We'll see what happens. Of course, we have our agents, Popov, Jepson, and Chernevsky. Chernevsky was, by this time, he had been assigned to the fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group. So he's actually assigned there as a Polish officer, so the Germans think. And so he's really an inside guy. He's got several sources, particularly Canadian sources, that are reporting on units arriving and so forth. He actually made a trip for the Germans up into Scotland and reported invasion preparations in Scotland. they would report things like he saw orders for 50,000 pairs of ski bindings, for example, which gives you an idea. Maybe Norway's a possibility. And of course, we know that Jensen was Popoff's official handler in Lisbon. By this time, Jebsen had flipped over to the Allied side. And then we have Treasure, our Peruvian Elvira Fuente Chaudois, Bronx, known as Bronx, and the great Juan Pujol Garcia Garbo. And these agents convinced the Germans that the invasion would be at Calais. And just before D-Day, what's really incredible, Garbo's intelligence is viewed with such favor in Berlin that Hitler awards him the Iron Cross, one of the highest German military honors. How ironic. It's supposed to be a groan with that, but I guess everybody's muted. I couldn't hear it. Anyway, so what did they do? They took this approach called order of battle, and that's a military jargon, which really stands for like an organization chart. The Allied strategy was to feed the Germans a fake organization that there were these three armies and part of the army group. They were made up of this division, this division, this division, so forth. They were centered on the FUSAG, the first U.S. Army group in Southeast England, across the channel from Calais, and then they would let the Germans draw their own conclusions that the real invasion would come there. At this stage, they weren't saying, oh, they're going to invade at Calais. They would just say, these units are here in Kent, so forth. And I told you that Brutus was reassigned to FUSAG. He's a Polish officer. He creates this fake Canadian Army source that tells him about all the incoming units. And he will ultimately communicate the entire order of battle for Patton's fake army group of 45 divisions, which is huge. Now, the Allies had made a public announcement that the ground forces would be commanded by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. So, and it turns out they found an actor in Britain who interestingly looked a lot like Montgomery, and it this fellow Clifton James. So a week before D-Day, a week before D-Day, they arrange for the fake Monty to go to Gibraltar. He's meeting with the British. He arrives while, and they sequence this while the Spanish consul, Spain was neutral, but there were a lot of pro-Nazi elements in Spain, while the Spanish consul was meeting with the British Governor General in Gibraltar. Montgomery's car pulls up, Clifton James gets out, and the Governor General goes down to meet him, and he says, hello, Monty, how are you? And the Governor General's nickname was Rusty, and said, Rusty, it's good to see you again. And this guy is convinced that it is Montgomery. And as soon as he leaves his meeting with the British consul, he crosses the Spanish border. He's on the telephone. He's calling the Germans to tell him that a week before D-Day, Montgomery is in Gibraltar, and that they think it's not likely that the invasion is going to happen anytime soon, because they wouldn't do that with Montgomery away from the location. And then Lily, she sort of hits her stride. She visits her handler Kleeman, not in Paris, because Paris is occupied. She meets him in Lisbon. He gives her a radio telegraph transmitter, and Bletchley observes that he will pass her reports verbatim to Berlin. He doesn't edit, he doesn't condense. If she says that, he just passes it on word for word. Then she becomes a generator of very long and very accurate cribs. Remember the cribs that were were important for getting these bomb settings right, to finding the settings. She becomes a generator of very long and very accurate cribs, and her long cribs help speed up the bomb runs significantly. So now the Allies can decrypt the messages even faster. But despite doing all that good, we have this crisis. She will learn that her dog has died in British custody. She threatens her British case officer. She's about sending a signal that indicates that she's been compromised. And they're worried, now it's about a month before D-Day, they're worried about her. Which brings us to our agent, Bronx. And Elvira Chadois, Peruvian, has an appetite for the high life. She is not named for the New York borough of Bronx that we might think, but for a cocktail. A Bronx cocktail, and you may see one at the very beginning of the next film clip, is essentially a perfect martini, gin with 2 vermouths, but with a little bit of orange juice added. Apparently, it's rather potent. I looked at the recipe for it, and the only item in its recipe that doesn't have alcohol in it is the glass. So it's a pretty potent one. But anyhow, she's named for that. She would communicate largely by mail, where Lily would communicate by radio telegraph and sometimes by mail with secret ink. Bronx would use essentially secret ink all the time. There's an interesting little film clip about here. I hope the audio is okay on this. If it's too loud, this is a new clip, and if the audio is too loud, I'll try to turn it down.
Bronx sent her messages not by wireless, but by post. To her German spy master between the lines of ordinary letters using a matchstick, impregnated with secret ink. Using the impregnated match, secret invisible messages could be written over ordinary correspondence. Once in enemy hands, the ink would be chemically developed to reveal the key information. Samples of Bronx's letters have been released to the National Archives in Kew. Tell me what we have here in this file.
Well, this is the file of Bronx, one of the double agents, and it includes a whole range of documents relating to the way she was controlled in the United Kingdom, but also some of the texts of some of the secret messages that she sent to her German controllers.
What is this, Mark?
Yeah, this is a photograph taken by MI5 of the secret message, which was written underneath a message.
In capital letters, she's written, "Last week I saw a man unload a lorry full of foodstuffs into an old empty house next to the church at Roehampton." It's not exactly going to change the war, is it?
No. Well, I mean, you're not going to give all of your best stuff at once either, and it's part of it's a way of stringing people along.
There's a bit of a boy's own paper ring to the idea of secret ink. Was it important in the Second World War?
Yeah, and it had been since the First World War. But I mean, the point about this sort of means of communication is it just took an awfully long time, because it's going to take the best part of 2 weeks to get there, probably.
So it's a kind of cumulative effect, her traffic.
Yeah, and it's also making the best of what you got, because if you don't have wireless communications, how are you going to do it? No mobile phones in that time.
So, Bronx will get a toothache. Bletchley intercepts a German order moving a Panzer division from Bordeaux to Normandy. And Bronx now uses the few rapid means of communication to send a message. She sends a wire to her banker in Lisbon, again, neutral country, asking for money to be sent to her, wired to her dentist in Britain. The Lisbon banker, who's on the German payroll, advises the Germans, and it turns out it's a coded message, predetermined, means there can be an invasion near Bordeaux within a week. So she sends this wired message. It gets passed to the Germans. The Germans get to tip off that there's going to be an invasion in Bordeaux in a week. Okay, so this was intended to stop the movement of this German division. But at the same time, she sends mail by post using the invisible ink saying that the Bordeaux invasion has been postponed. And she says that her source is a member of the British aristocracy named David Ormsby Gore. Bronx had never met Ormsby Gore. Now, and she says that Ormsby Gore told her while drunk about the Bordeaux invasion. And then the next day, he called her to say that he was wrong, that the Bordeaux invasion had been delayed by a month because of a shortage of landing craft. Now, her invisible ink message saying that it had been delayed arrived after D-Day. And she had never met David Ormsby Gore. And for those of you who don't know who he is, he was a classmate of JFK at Oxford in the late 1930s. He later became, here's a picture of JFK and Ormsby Gore together when Kennedy was president. He later he's the the British ambassador to the US when Kennedy was president. And he gave, Ormsby Gore, by the way, gave JFK some very good advice during the Cuban Missile Crisis as to the location of the quarantine line. And Ormsby Gore, since none of this information was out at the time, Ormsby Gore died in 1985, never knowing that he was an unwitting participant in this Allied deception plan. And I've got a film clip here from about Bronx with her MI5 handler.
As the days counted down to D-Day, Bronx would need a way to get messages to her German spy master much faster.
We intercepted a movement order to a German panzer division, which at that time was stationed near Bordeaux, to move to the Normandy area, which is exactly what we didn't want. And really, without very much of hope of success, I said that I would try and use Bronx to prevent the division moving.
The tanks would be in Normandy within days, unless Bronx could convince her spy masters that they were needed more urgently elsewhere. Now, secret ink was not Bronx's only way of communicating with her handler, was it?
Oh no, there were sort of crash messages, if you like, that were conveying an innocuous, so a telegram, for example, conveying an innocuous message, or had a prearranged significance to her controller, and therefore you could get a certain degree of immediacy to it, but again, you had to be very, very careful about what you did and didn't say.
It says, envoyez vite 50 livres, j'ai besoin pour mon dentiste, send quickly £50, I need it for my dentist. But that actually meant
it actually warns that there's going to be an invasion in the Bay of Biscay.
I must confess I was astonished within hours seeing this message relayed to Berlin. Within 24 hours, an order cancelling the movement order for the, I think it was a Panzer division, I think it was the 13th Panzer division, but I'm not sure. And so nobody was more surprised than myself, I must confess. But
so it worked. You know, I was at a meeting several years back. I believe it was over at Lovett School with a really good historian named Rick Atkinson. And Atkinson, in response to a question about how important Bletchley Park was, Atkinson said, oh, he didn't think that Bletchley Park had affected anything much in the war. And I held my tongue, but I almost stood up and made some statement like one of my kids did at school when a teacher told him that in the Second World War that Churchill didn't do much and the Battle of Britain wasn't important. My youngest son stood up and said, Mrs. So-and-so, you're full of crap. So I almost threw that flag on him, but this shows how important it was. How Bletchley Park knew what the Germans were falling for and not. Very important. Now there were some mysterious crossword puzzles appeared. In May of '44, they were worried that the intelligence officers were worried that crossword puzzles were functioning as a covert operation to pass intelligence along to the Nazis. And that in the London Daily Telegraph, a fellow named Leonard Dawe, D-A-W-E, was the Telegraph's crossword compiler, and he also happened to be the headmaster of a school outside London at Effingham. So in a lead up to D-Day, he came under suspicion again. The words Juno, Gold, and Sword, the code names for the British landing beaches, appeared in the crossword, but they didn't worry about that too much because they were pretty common crossword answers. But then these answers started popping up. Utah, which is one of the American beach, the beach to the farthest west. Omaha, the beach is next to Utah. Neptune was the name of the operation for the naval operation to bring all the troops and equipment from Britain to the landing beaches. Mulberry was a name for the artificial harbors, and Overlord was the overall name for the operation. So now the MI5 officers, particularly with Utah and Omaha popping up, they really freaked out over this. And these other clues came up, and they got a hold of the Leonard Dawe, the Telegraph compiler, the London Daily Telegraph's crossword compiler, and they really grilled him. And Dawe told them that as an assignment for his kids, he routinely asked them for his students to come up with entries for the crossword puzzle. And these were ones that had come from his students. And it turns out that near where the school was in Effingham, there was a large contingent of Canadian and American officers, and the kids would hang out with them a lot. I've had a number of older British people tell me how many chocolate bars and packages of chewing gum they got from GIs in Britain. The kids would walk down the street and see the soldiers. The soldiers, the Americans and the Canadians apparently would talk about this, never believing the kids could be a possible security risk. And these names popped up, and the kids passed them on and put them in a crossword puzzle. So, but they didn't figure this out till well after D-Day. So it was another heartburn issue at the time. And then we know about Johnny Jepson is in prison. The Allied fear is that he will talk and not only compromise Popoff, but the entire Doublecross operation. And they actually sort of back off Popoff's involvement right before D-Day because they're worried about Jepson. But we get a big assist from the Germans. We've seen this fellow before, Alexis von Run. Alexis von Run is the fellow who told Hitler that the Operation Mincemeat intelligence was good. He was an ardent Christian. He was not a fan of Hitler. He routinely overestimated the Allied strength, and some of that came from, for those of you that ever worked on budgets and business, you sometimes inflated your needs because you knew that somebody was going to cut them anyway. And he would routinely overestimate the Allied forces. Hitler's SS, the SD security would cut von Run's estimates in half, but Hitler trusted von Run. Von Run estimated there were 89 divisions in Britain when there weren't but 44. Essentially, he almost doubled them. And 89 divisions would have been enough for a diversionary landing in Normandy, plus the real thing at Calais. So now the Germans believe the Allies have clearly enough forces in Britain to do both Normandy and Calais. And then we get an unknowing assist from the Japanese. This fellow, Baron General Oshima, was here we see him on a tour of the Atlantic Wall. He's the Japanese ambassador in Berlin. He had extensive tours of the Atlantic Wall, and he would communicate the defense plans in great deal to Tokyo. Okay, and that was good because we had broken the Japanese diplomatic code, the Purple Code, in 1941. So we're getting detailed information about what's the defenses on the Atlantic Wall. Oshima will spend most of May 27th, 1944, about 10 days before D-Day, with Hitler, and they're talking about what will the Allies do. And he will communicate it to Tokyo the very next day. And I've got a little film clip that talks about this.
Hitler's absolute control over his armed forces meant that his was the only decision that really mattered. Whether or not he believed the D-Day lie would make or break the Allied invasion. Just before D-Day, Hitler met the Japanese ambassador, Baron Hiroshi Oshima. The Fuhrer was keen to talk about the invasion and his knowledge of Allied plans. Impressed, Oshima immediately radioed back a report of his conversation to Tokyo. 2 days later, the report, decoded and translated, landed on Robertson's desk. Hitler was adamant. They will come forward all out across the Straits of Dover. The target was Calais.
So that's where I would argue with Rick Atkinson about the contributions of Bletchley Park. And even some last-minute adjustments from Enigma were important. Here's a map of the, you see the landing beaches to the right, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword is sort of off this map. That the 82nd Airborne was set to land here on the west side of the Continental Peninsula. Enigma decrypts showed that the German 91st Division, shown in this circle, had just moved into that area. And they certainly didn't want to drop the 82nd on top of a German division, a first-line division like the 91st. So they shifted the 82nd's drop zone over closer to San Mariglis. For those of you that watched the movie The Longest Day, the Red Buttons plays an American paratrooper who comes down in the middle of San Mariglis, whose parachute hangs on the steeple of the church. And so Bletchley Park saves the 82nd Airborne from a bloodbath, but not dropping them on top of the German 91st Divisions. So D-Day, weather's bad. Ironically, 4 years before, during the evacuation from Dunkirk, the English Channel was as calm as a mill pond. Now the tides are raging. There are high seas, lots of rain, terrible weather. The poor weather conditions convince the Germans the Allies will not land for at least a week. And if you look over this shoulder of mine, you see those pieces of paper on the wall. Those are from the weather report that RAF Group Captain Stagg gave to Eisenhower on the night of the late evening of June the 5th, telling them despite the weather being so bad that the weather's going to clear and you'll have 24 to 48 hours of marginally acceptable weather on June 6th. But the Germans are convinced weather's too bad. On June 5th, Rommel goes to Ulm in Germany to celebrate his wife's 50th birthday, which happened to be on June 6th. We had no idea when Rommel's wife's birthday was, but he goes on June 6th. I will guarantee you that there's probably somebody in the Pentagon whose job is to keep up with the wives' birthdays of Russian and certain Chinese military officials now. But nonetheless, so Rommel goes to Germany, Sepp Dietrich goes on holiday to Brussels, the remaining generals go to a wargaming conference in Brawn, about 100 miles south of Normandy. And again, Eisenhower tells Doublecross, keep this 15th Army out of my hair for 3 days. So Rommel decides to visit his wife.
Morgen lang. Was Wichtiges?
Nicht viel. Jagdbomber haben gestern Nachmittag am Pas-de-Calais angegriffen. Heute Nacht keine besonderen Vorkommnisse. Dieser Sturm.
Ja, Das Wetter, das Einzige, was mich heute früh interessiert. Dieser Sturm, auf einmal war er da, wie aus dem Nichts, ganz plötzlich. Hat mir alle meine Rosen heruntergefegt. Wellenhöhe im Kanal 1,5 Meter, Windgeschwindigkeit 50 bis 60 Stundenkilometer.
Die Luftwaffe sagt, dass das für den Monat Juni der schwerste Sturm seit 20 Jahren über dem Kanal war.
Hat Berchtesgaden bestätigt, dass ich zum Vortag erwartet werde?
Ist jetzt noch nicht der Feldmarschall. General Jodl ist heute beim Führer. Wir werden verständigt, sobald der Termin festliegt. Wollen der Feldmarschall trotzdem nach Deutschland fahren wie geplant?
Können Sie sich einen besseren Zeitpunkt vorstellen, Lang? Das Wetter soll noch eine ganze Woche so stürmisch bleiben. Wie jetzt. Haben Sie sie?
Jawohl, Herr Feldmarschall.
Geben Sie mal her. Schuhe. Für meine Frau. Habe ich extra in Paris anfertigen lassen. Für ihren Geburtstag. Morgen. Am 6. Juni.
Ergebensten Glückwunsch an die junge Frau, Herr Feldmarschall.
Danke Ihnen, Speider. Ich verstehe nicht, warum die nicht den Mai angegriffen haben. Die Wetterlage war genau richtig. Gezeiten ebenfalls. Und jetzt? Das wäre allerdings unangenehm, wenn Sie ausgerechnet jetzt kämen. Fahren Sie los. Aber ich glaube, wir brauchen uns keine Sorgen zu machen.
The most incredible fact that I discovered in researching this was, despite all the efforts to keep everything a huge secret, the Allies tell the Germans. The Doublecross Committee convinces Eisenhower to communicate the Normandy invasion plans at H-hour minus 3, which would be about 3:30 in the morning. H-hour was 6:30. At 3:30 in the morning, have Garbo just tell Madrid that there's going to be a landing in Normandy. Garbo says it would take 3.5 hours for the message to get from Madrid to Berlin after decrypting it in Madrid, re-encrypting it to send it again on a different network to Berlin. He said it'd take 3.5 hours. It would arrive in Berlin just after the Normandy landings, too late to be effectual. But turns out the Madrid telegraph operator was asleep. It takes them an extra hour and a half to get in touch with Madrid. The word gets to Berlin 5 hours later. It's an hour and a half after the invasion has begun, but nonetheless, they knew that the message was being sent earlier, so it solidifies the authenticity of Garbo. And here's the house that in the early wee hours of June 6, 1944, Garbo telegraphed the Abwehr in Madrid, telling them that the Allies were going to land in Normandy at 06:30. And it's even recognized that Garbo lived and worked here. He was a star, as you'll see later. So there's a lot of confusion. Many, including Hitler, fall for this ploy. They think Normandy is only a diversion. The real invasion will occur in Calais. Rommel is dumbstruck by the fact that it even happens because of the weather.
Danke, Liebe, die sind ja wunderbar.
Probier erst mal, ob es dir auch passt. Ja, hier ist Rommel. Guten Morgen. Was? Was? Wo? Normandie? Haben Sie sich schon am Stand festgesetzt? Sie müssen unter allen Umständen zurückgeworfen werden. Was ist mit der Panzerreserve? Hat von Rundstedt schon die Freigabe vom Führerhauptquartier erreicht? So. Ja. Null. Normandie. Normandie. Wie dumm von mir. Dumm.
Now, Garbo will raise hell. He will send incendiary messages to his Nazi handlers. he reminds them, I told you what the Allied plans were, and you did nothing. And in his, someone described Garbo as suffering from verbal incontinence. He goes to town with the Germans. He says, "This makes me question your seriousness and sense of responsibility. I therefore demand a clarification of what has occurred. You got to explain to me what you've done. I'm very disgusted in this struggle for life and death. Were it not for my ideals and my faith in Nazism, I would abandon this work." So he's raising hell about, why didn't you do something? I told you about it. Brutus continues to give him spoon feeding. He apologizes for missing Normandy. He says, because I was busy getting info on Fusag, I didn't pick up on this diversionary attack in Normandy. And then he will proceed to transmit the entire order of battle for Patton's completely fake U.S. Army group. So now there's no more hints about invasion at Calais. Germans are told that, hey, it's still coming. And based on the Enigma intercepts, the Allies know that the Germans are still worried more about the first U.S. Army group coming across to Calais than the invasion that's in process in Normandy. Plus, Brutus reports that invasion forces are gathering in the north of Scotland, and an attack on Norway is in the works. So the Germans are getting the complete spiel about First Army Group, possible invasion in Norway, and pretty much the Germans fall for it hook, line, and sinker. But a month after D-Day, we've landed, we've established a pretty strong presence, but they get bogged down in the hedgerow country in Normandy. And Eisenhower activates the 3rd U.S. Army and sends George Patton to command it to Normandy to lead the Allied breakout. But now this complicates the whole Fusag thing, because now the 3rd Army's activated, Patton's in Normandy. How can he be commanding this 1st U.S. Army group that's going to land in Calais? Garbo goes to work convincingly telling them that Patton has been demoted. He's now subordinate to General Bradley, and that Fusag is still poised to invade at Calais. The upshot is this will work. The Germans will mount a counterattack in Normandy on June 6th, but only with the troops that they have nearby. The 150,000 men of the German 5th Army, remember that Eisenhower wanted to keep them out of my hair for 3 days? They are kept in Calais for 7 weeks to repel the fake Fusag. And 300,000 troops in Norway stay for an invasion that never comes. And the decoding, the deception, and the double cross makes fortitude and double cross exceed all expectations. But they're not through with deception. It really didn't stop with D-Day. Just after D-Day, Hitler starts launching rockets, first these V-1 rockets, and then later these V-2 ballistic missiles on Southeast England and particularly London. After these attacks began, Churchill commissions an operation called Operation Crossbow, puts his son-in-law, Duncan Sands, in charge of it to somehow stop these German rocket attacks. Now, the weapons are indeed hitting central London, but Garbo reports them long. He says, this one is long now, because he only reports the ones that were long. So the Germans realize that, well, we're shooting long, we need to shorten, we need to adjust in guidance systems to shorten the aim. So they shorten it and they miss London even more. Now, the folks in the countryside in Southeast England probably would not be thrilled by this, but nonetheless, they get the Germans to shorten their aim, and the missiles will miss London even more than they would have otherwise. So D-Day will succeed with many fewer casualties than expected. And even the struggle to break out was difficult, was much more difficult if the 150,000 troops from Calais had been moved down from the 15th Army, if any of the troops from Norway had been moved. So you could argue that the soldiers, sailors, and airmen in the Normandy invasion got a huge assist from this totally unknown and invisible group of mathematicians, code breakers, liars, and deceivers. And it really wasn't just a one battle issue. Had we failed in Normandy, and 150,000 troops moving from Calais down could well have made the difference between success and failure. Had we lost this battle, Hitler may have lost the war to the Russians anyway. But had that occurred, the Soviet Empire would have extended not to Berlin, as we remember, but it would have extended to the English Channel. So it was a huge impact in world affairs. And it was made possible by this incredible little puzzle of decoding, deception, and double cross. And I'm ready for some discussion. And next week, we're going to look at what ultimately happened to these unknown heroes, these machines, these places that were important to make this happen. We'll see what happens to them.
Yep.
Can we unmute everybody? We'll do.
Basically, if they can, do you want to do the raise the hand function? That if everybody can switch to gallery view, and then raise your hand if you have any questions for Bill.
Are we unmuted? Can you guys hear me?
Basically, yeah. What I'll do is I'll just ask them to unmute when they raise their hand.
Okay.
Paul, do you want to go?
Yes. In the movie Patton, the Germans could not believe that a general as accomplished as Patton would ever be demoted because of slapping a soldier. They thought it was a deception, and they were firmly convinced that Patton was going to lead the invasion.
Yeah, and they took advantage of this with the whole fuseg deception. It was counter. I think it was completely counter to the Nazis' culture, if nothing else. They just couldn't believe it's got to be this guy, because they had faced him it faced him in North Africa and in Sicily, and why it's inconceivable that you'll demote a guy like this just for slapping a soldier. You're right. Again, that was one of those kind of things that it wasn't pre-planned, but they sure as heck took advantage of it.
Madeline, can you?
Madeline
has.
Maybe I am just not very bright this morning, but I don't understand why the Allies wanted to inform the Germans about D-Day right when they were doing it. Why? I don't get it.
What they wanted to do is they wanted to completely confirm Garbo's credibility.
Okay.
If you think about it, the word was going to get to them ideally 30 minutes after the invasion started anyway.
Okay.
So they weren't telling them anything that they didn't already know. Okay. Except what they did is they had this guy communicate to them before the invasion, because remember the message was transmitted to Madrid like at 3 a.m. Okay, which was ahead of the invasion. But Garbo knew enough of the mechanics that he knew the word wouldn't get to Berlin until 6:30 or 7 o'clock at best. And so it was all done to enhance his credibility. such that the next time he tells them that they're still planning to come across at Calais, feeds them information in reinforcing the first U.S. Army group and all that stuff, so they know that, hey, this guy had the information on the Normandy invasion, and he told us about it. And so
I feel better now.
yeah.
Yeah.
It was really just to enhance his credibility, but for the other things that he was going to tell him, including even later down the pike, the fact that the V1s and V2s were overshooting London when they really weren't. In fact, it was one of the members of the Doublecross committee said about 4 or 5 days before D-Day, you know, I cannot believe that we're going to pull this thing off. And if you think about it, it's pretty incredible. And these people, this whole mechanism was exceptionally helpful to D-Day. Again, if those 150,000 troops had moved, the Germans had moved them from Calais into Normandy, the outcome could have been much, much different and much, much worse. That's not to take away from the soldiers and sailors and airmen that did it, but they sort of had these little guardian angels on their shoulders helping take care of them, and there were people that whose stories, some of them, their stories were not told till after they were dead and gone.
Joy, wait a second, Joy. You can unmute.
Okay. Where were the Russians? Were they in on the plot or not? Or did we still suspect them and not tell them a whole hell of a lot?
When you were talking about were they in on the plot, did they know about D-Day when it was happening? Yeah, of course, they knew that. They knew, Stalin knew that from the Tehran conference.
But did they know the details of when and where?
Yes, they knew when and where. Oh, well, they knew roughly when. They knew where, and now, neither Churchill or Roosevelt said anything to him about Bletchley or Doublecross or any of that. However, there were 5 of the Cambridge spy ring, Kim Philby, Anthony Blunt, Donald McLean. Philby knew about Bletchley Park. Anthony Blunt, who was a Soviet agent, knew about Doublecross. So it's almost certain that Stalin knew about both operations, but they weren't. Stalin had not been told about that to by either Churchill or Roosevelt, and it's almost amazing that somehow that didn't leak back to the Germans.
Yeah, because I wondered how much they really trusted the Russians, or I suppose allies.
I think there was probably reason for some distrust on both sides. Stalin was always paranoid. He was, of course, you know, there's no saying that it's easy to be paranoid when everybody's out to get you.
Yeah.
But it was amazing that that there wasn't some leak there. And by the way, the British did pass on some intelligence to the Russians that came from Bletchley. There was in fact, the largest tank battle in history happened at a place called Kursk. And I can't remember where Kursk was in, what was now Belarus or now the Ukraine. But Bletchley had intercepted the Germans, had intercepted German plans, and they passed that information on to Stalin. They never told him it was from a decryption operation or anything like that. But hell, he had to know it by this time because he had agents that knew about Bletchley Park. And that contributed significantly to the Germans' victory at Kursk. It was huge. There were over 5,000 tanks, if you can imagine that, in one battle that lasted about 3 days.
Anybody? Oops. Uh-oh. Anybody else have any questions? In that case, if everyone can mute themselves and give a warm applause for a great presentation by Bill.
Yay!
Thank you very much.
Yay!
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah. Hey, George, Lauren, and Martha, you want to hold on for a second?
Okay.
Bye all. I'll see you next week.
Right on. Bye-bye.
Oh, wait a second. Eileen had a question. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm still
Eileen,
here.
Clap.
I'm sorry.
That's just clapping.
Okay. Okay.
Oh, no question.
Yes, though, how much of a factor was weather in their planning?
Huge. In fact, the fact that the weather was so bad, and it was in the movie the Longest Day, which is based on a book that Cornelius Ryan wrote called The Longest Day. In fact, it's pretty true to the book, and the book was written. The book was written based on interviews. Cornelius Ryan, actually, I think he hired Reader's Digest to do telephone interviews. Who was we had a World War II veteran and at senior U, Don Anderson, for example. Don was not at D-Day, but for example, had Don been a D-Day veteran, there's a good chance that that he would have been called in an interview, do a phone interview, and Ryan collected his information this way. And one of the ironic things was the expression popped up several times among different people, either enlisted men or officers on both sides, that would say, "I wonder whose side God is on," particularly for the Allies when the weather was so bad. When the weather was so bad and they're trying to get ready, and the invasion was supposed to be on the 5th. And the weather was so bad, and these guys are on these landing craft. They're at sea. They sail. In fact, they had sailed, and they get sort of halfway to where they're supposed to be, and then they're called back because of the weather. So now these guys are bouncing on these ships. They're getting seasick already, and then they have to wait another day. The Germans are convinced probably not going to happen. And this guy named John Stagg, he was the group captain, he's an old Scotsman. He was the RAF meteorologist for Eisenhower. And those pages you see on the wall behind me is his barometric charts that he had that it convinced him that starting on the 6th that Eisenhower was going to have 24 to 48 hours of barely tolerable weather. And they were so worried that the Germans would figure this thing out because they had like a 500,000 troops in the south, and actually in the west of England. If you look behind me on the map of England, where you see where the white bands are, most of the American troops came from that area, so they had to come around a long way. But the Germans were pretty sure it wasn't going to happen, and consequently, you had Rommel and most of the German senior commanders were away from Normandy when this happened. So, number one, the Germans couldn't believe that it wouldn't be Patton, and they couldn't believe that Eisenhower would make a decision to invade in the kind of weather that they thought was going to be there. So the weather was played greatly to our advantage. I'm not sure you would have convinced any of the soldiers on those landing crafts. They're bouncing up,
Yeah.
you know, plus and minus 3 or 4 feet. You'd have a hell of a time convincing them it was to their advantage to be in weather like that. But the Germans were fooled on what was going to happen and on the timing. They were so sure that Eisenhower wouldn't invade then that all the senior commanders were gone from the scene. That made a big difference too. They would have reacted much. Had Rommel still been there, I think his chateau we saw was near Rouen in North. Had he been there, the German counterattack would have been much faster, much more effective. So weather helped us.
It's amazing.
Yeah. So this is about the time when one of the German commanders muttered, "I wonder whose side's God's on," because they had been completely fooled by what happened.
Really sure would be able to go get this.
Yeah.
Holy smokes. We're going to stop our recording now.